Good afternoon. It's good to have you here. It's a beautiful day at the World Pork Expo. I've got a lot of slides, but we're going to go through them as fast as we can because I don't want to keep you in here any longer than we have to. Go enjoy the show and see all the things that we have out here. Key issues for this profitability. Input prices, obviously a big one. We're kind of at the same spot we were a year ago on that one. A year ago at this time, I told the audience if it rains, we have $4 corn. If it doesn't, we have $8 corn. I've said ever since then that everyone heard the first part and nobody heard the second part. I'm going to tell you pretty much again the same thing on that topic. Demand, of course, quite critical long-term success and has some short-term impacts for sure. Domestic economic conditions a big deal. World economy, competition, and demand in the pork and livestock and meat businesses. Exports and a resolution to the challenges we have right now is a big deal. It's caused some problems this spring, no question. And finally, competitor protein supplies and prices. Both of those should be positive for our business, at least in the foreseeable future. Outlook levels for next year, and then prices and margins. On the input costs and input prices and production cost issue, I started this winter saying that it really boiled down to a set of questions, and some of those we have some answers for now. Will it rain? I think the question to that one is yes, it is. It will rain, at least for now, and at least on areas east of the Mississippi. The Missouri River. Where will it rain? Well, most places that it was in need, except for the Western Plains, and we'll talk about that in specific. When? Well, it's certainly rained early. That doesn't mean it will rain the rest of the summer, and Elwyn's point about 1947 and some of the situations we've had where it didn't rain after wet springs is kind of a cause for concern at the present time. How much will it rain? Well, right around here, plenty. Thank you very much for the moment. We'd just as soon not have any for a while. And finally, and this really is the question for the rest of the summer, will it be hot? And will it be hot at the wrong times or the right times, and how hot will it be? It's going to be a very important question this year. The last few weeks, April 16th on the left, May 28th on the right, we've had some improvement in drought conditions in the Corn Belt. It's kind of the improvement has kept going west. It's about to the Missouri River at this point, but if you notice the high plains, are still quite dry. Now, they've gotten some rain since this map was made a week and a half ago that has helped that situation some, but there are still some real drought areas in the west, and that has a real impact on the cow-calf business especially. The high plains still 55% in severe or worse drought. Notice the Midwest, just a fraction of the acres. For context, I think we have to think about this and go back to 2011. This was the drought monitor in August of 2011, and of course, severe conditions in Texas and Oklahoma. Why is that important? Well, because that drove a huge run-up in cow slaughter that summer. And we're just now feeling the impacts of that cow slaughter on beef supplies. It's a long tail in the beef industry. And so what's happening with $210 carcass beef the last few weeks has to do with the summer of 2011 and some things that's happened since then, but that was the genesis of this situation in the beef business. Well, what does that mean for next year? That means that the drought of 2012 hasn't fully been impacted on the beef business yet. It'll be next year sometime before we feel that. And of course, last year, that drought covered a much larger area. It wasn't as bad in Texas and Oklahoma, but if you go north from there up through Nebraska and the Dakotas, you were still very dry conditions in some places where we have a lot of beef cows. I have a friend that manages a ranch in Stanford, Texas. And he moved about 5,000 cows from the Texas Panhandle, summer before last, to western Nebraska. And last summer, he told me, he said, if it's raining too much at your house, give me a call. I'll bring my cows there, and it'll quit. Okay? So that's kind of the way it's just, he'd figured out that wherever his cows are, it wasn't going to rain. That's kind of how it was working. And I guess right now we ought to give him a call and have him bring a few to Iowa. That would probably be a good thing. Then last year, of course, on April 24th, we looked at this map and said, well, it's a little dry in northern Iowa and southern Minnesota, but, we're in pretty good shape with little inkling of what was to come last year. And so, of course, now we're dealing with that, and the question is, will we have to deal with it another year? This whole thing, the changes in input costs, have shifted the growth curves of output among the livestock and meat industry. If you look at this, the red line there is chicken. That dip in 2009 was caused mainly by the bankruptcy of Pilgrim's Pride, and notice that the trend upward has been basically flat since that time as they adjusted to higher costs. If you look at the pork industry, we had a surge in output in 2008 caused by circovirus vaccines and the fact that a lot of pigs now live to market that used to not live to market. And I would contend that we would have gone from that point on a normal upward sloping curve had it not been for input prices jumping in 2008 and 9 and 10. What has happened? We've actually went down a couple of years. Now we're back on the same line, and we'll see it more graphically later, that we were on before that, but that line really ought to be up at taking off and going upward from the point of 2008's increase in productivity due to our technological advance of vaccines. In the case of cattle, they were on the same trend that they've been on for the last 10, 15 years until the last 2 years, and what's happened? Well, of course, drought hits them more directly than it does the rest of us because of their need for grass for their cow-calf and backgrounding operations. Of course, the result, massive losses in the cattle feeding business and in hogs, and we're still adjusting to those, making some adjustments. And by the way, anytime you just maintain output in the United States, you're actually reducing output per capita because the population grows by 1%. And in the case of the pork industry, we tend to export more product each year, meaning that we're shorting the market a little more here. So you don't have to cut production to cut supplies per capita or total availability in the U.S., and that's really what we've been up to the last couple of years. The situation we're in now, May 28, 2013 on the right, I kind of ran over the heading there. May 29th a year ago on the right, May 28th of this year on the left. The lesson here is things weren't that bad last May, and they turned out pretty bad. So they can still turn out bad this year. All in all, I would rather be wet than dry. It needs to dry up some around here and all of the Corn Belt. But water in most cases, as I tell friends, if you don't drown some corn, you probably don't have enough water for the rest of it. And in that case, we've certainly got some water here. So, critical issues. Delayed plantings are going to have several impacts. One of them is how many unplanted corn acres we're going to have. I've heard anywhere from 2 to 9 million. Somewhere probably about 3 or 4 is probably going to catch it, maybe 5. But one of the things that's impacting this year that we haven't had before is a deadline on crop insurance. And we're going to have some acres that aren't going to be planted because they can claim crop insurance on those acres that used to not play into this. So there's one of those policy decisions that may have some unintended consequences. How many will go to soybeans? A lot of that depends on, again, how quickly it dries up, but there still could be soybeans planted on some of those areas. What's the yield impact? The consensus, as Elwin pointed out a moment ago, the consensus now is that yield potential has been probably dropped from the high 150s or 160 into the mid 140s somewhere, maybe 147. I would concur with that at this point. The market's kind of indicating that. There's a lot of information that goes into those market prices. They tell us a lot if we'll listen. It definitely brings an early frost into play. A year ago, one of the few conclusions we could make at that time was early frost is not a problem this year because we got everything planted so early. This year, because of the lateness of planting, early frost is definitely a risk factor for 2013. Key information pieces to mark on your calendar next week, June 12th. The WASDE comes out, the June WASDE, and we'll see what USDA, their first kind of adjustment to the yield will be. They won't play with the acres, I don't think. They normally don't do that until they have their acreage report at the end of June, and that comes out the 28th of June, as is noted here. And then the grain stocks report will come out the 28th of June. I have some friends at USDA that I've been accusing they use a random number generator to do that grain stocks report because it's kind of all over the map these days, but we'll see what it says then. Get your bingo cards ready. Okay. World situation on corn. Growing output above consumption, so we build stocks this year according to the Foreign Ag Service. But notice, even as we build stocks back up to a little over 150 million metric tons, the stocks-to-use ratio for this coming year is still close to record low. So there's still plenty of positive pressure on corn prices. About 80% of that gain in stocks, according to FAS, is supposed to happen here in the United States. So all this problem with our corn crop says that those world stocks may not grow nearly as much as they do since they were counting on us to do it. The other point is the majority of those world stocks, according to USDA, are held in China. And if you think our grain stocks report is done by a random number generator, anything coming out of China is done with a random number generator. You never know how accurate that is, whether it's been placed out there as a matter of national security. You have no idea. So we think we're right. The USDA does the best they can on that. They probably got as good a numbers for China as anybody in the world, including the Chinese. And so, but that's a risk factor. On the soybean side, onward and upward. Production growing, consumption growing, stocks at record levels, the stocks-to-use ratio for the world near record levels, and yet we have $14 plus beans. This is a demand-driven business. The demand is terrific. It's virtually all in Asia. I mean, that's where the real strength is. We don't see any kind of we don't see any real slacking of that at any time soon. The point about the soybean situation is even with all that production, it doesn't help the U.S. situation in the short run. The end of this marketing year could see some real fireworks on both the corn and the soybean markets in some areas. Basis levels are going to be crazy in places, especially that have a lot of ethanol plants, where, you know, as I point out to people, we will not run out of corn, we will not run out of soybeans. That doesn't mean that some areas won't run out of corn and soybeans. And it could be pretty volatile here as we go through the rest of this summer. In addition, the late season planting means we won't have any early harvested corn or beans this year to help that supply situation at the end of this marketing year like we did a year ago. So last year's marketing year was shortened because of early harvest. This year's marketing year is lengthened because of early harvest last year and potentially late harvest this year. So we've got, this thing's going to have to stretch a little farther than normal at a time when we don't have much to stretch. On the wheat side, world situation, again, pretty good crops this year. We've got a little bit of growth in wheat stocks after a big reduction a year ago due to dry conditions in Russia. But still, is the U.S. frost damage fully included in this? Again, that gain in stocks could go down given what's happened in our hard red winter wheat areas, where in Texas, Oklahoma, western Kansas, they didn't get 1, 2, or 3 frosts. They got 4, and one of them was like 22 degrees. I mean, it was pretty severe, and so that crop has been hurt. Our soft red winter wheat situation in the eastern part of the United States should be pretty good and probably can give us some help on feed ingredients this summer if the prices are competitive. Stocks-to-use ratio is better than it was recently, but still 5% lower than that period before 2000. So this business has tightened considerably over the years. We still maintain about 25% of a year's worth usage in stocks on the wheat side, and I would just attribute that to the fact that this is human food we're talking about here, and you don't use up nearly as much of it as you would for something else. I'm going to skip that one. Corn demand, ethanol, output is growing again. And that's after a year or 10 months of significantly lower ethanol production, which proves that ethanol producers actually do respond to corn prices. And they did respond to corn prices to the extent that the law and the availability of RINs would allow them to do so. They lost money. You can see here returns above cash costs were basically zero for about 7 months, according to Iowa State University, and that means that if you're not covering your variable costs, some of those plants weren't covering variable costs. They closed and they shut down. They stopped operating. Well, we're now generating some cash returns over variable costs, so we're seeing some of those plants reopen and we see production increasing. Now, will it increase to the pre-levels last year? I don't think so. But I think we're going to have this 36 to 37 million gallons per day production rate for the rest of this crop year, and it can increase from that. We have capacity. Obviously, we've produced almost over 40 million gallons per day at the end of 2011 when people were trying to scramble and capture the blender's tax credit before it went away. And so we can produce that many, and we very well might again, given what this corn supply situation does. Margins on ethanol crush are good again. The bottom panel, I think, is probably the more useful of the two. It's a little bit lower DDGS yield, a more realistic one than the theoretical level of 17.8 pounds. There is no amount put in here for oil. We can add from what I understand, 5 to 10 cents per bushel in returns from spinning oil out of this. So they could be a little better than that for some plants. The renewable fuel standards is still there. It's 13.8 billion gallons of starch-based ethanol this year, 14.4 next year, 15 billion in the following year. You can see we're back to producing just about what the mandate requires instead of overproducing due to cost. Again, there's no real incentive to do this above the mandate at this point, but we're still a little bit short of that. We will be using RINs. One of the real problems is the mathematical reality here of blending 10% of gasoline and still getting ever-growing amounts blended is pretty tough when the amount of gasoline we're using is falling like a rock. We have responded to higher gasoline prices, much more efficient cars, and that's going to grow over time. And so that's the reason all the talk with adjusting the renewable fuel standard and the blend wall. And I don't think there's any way to get around adjusting to that. Now, my friends in the grain business say, oh, there's plenty of flexibility in the RFS. The EPA can take care of everything. And I always inform them that as a representative of the livestock industry, I'm not real crazy about the EPA being in charge of our future. So that's a concern to me, and I still think we need to change the law personally. The result, small increase in ethanol usage. The RFS is higher. We talked about that. We've saturated the E10 market. E85 certainly has not caught on. E15 is allowed, but not yet accepted, and is in fact being challenged in court. The Supreme Court will hear arguments on the E15 challenge, I guess, in their new term that will start in October. Profitable is production, but the blend wall means there's certainly no incentive to build new plants. We have plenty to meet the 15 billion gallon RFS in 2 years at the present time, and the key issue will be if they try to repetition that RFS and take some of that advanced biofuel and apply it to starch. That would not be a good thing as far as I'm concerned for our policy on ethanol. Feed demand. I think it's going to increase, let's just say 13, 14, but I don't think 735 million bushels of increased corn usage is probably in the cards. The USDA has got that number in there. It's about a 16% increase. We're going to grow hog numbers, but about the most I can get out of this, if we have a good corn crop, most I can get out of is maybe 2.5% more pigs. If we have more chickens, yeah, maybe, and the breeder flock is up 2% so far this year, and they could set more eggs than that, so they could grow by 3 or 4% pretty easily. If we had turkeys, that one's going to be a negative. They've got pretty soft demand that has hurt their economics the last year, and they're actually cutting numbers. On the cattle side, we're going to have lower numbers of cattle on feed. They're not quite as big a deal for corn anymore with the increased use of DDGS, but you add all that up, and how you get 15 or 16% increase in corn usage is kind of tough, especially now that we've learned to feed a lot of other things besides corn. We're not just going to forget how to do that because there's more corn available, especially if these alternatives are still available. So I think we've made a jump kind of to the other side, and so that big an increase sounds a little bit large to me in USDA's balance sheet. Of course, the yield shortfalls, Elwin talked about those. Is all this been caused by biofuels and drought and whatever? But the impacts of the two have been very different. The advent of the biofuels age in 2007 and 8, I think, marked a quantum change in costs, in the cost of grains. The drought of 2012 is a short crop year. That's different. And you can look back at the 1995 numbers for corn on the left-hand chart here and see what happened that year. Of course, we had a big spike to record high prices of corn at that time, and then it went back down because we had a good crop the next year. And that's what the entire livestock business is kind of banking on at this point. They're betting on a good crop for this year, and if they're right, then hanging on, maintaining our breeding herd size will have been certainly the right decision. And it was probably the right decision even if the corn crop comes out bad. We can always go back and liquidate. It's going to be a tough situation if we do. But we've been in a short crop situation, not another quantum change, in my opinion. And I think the evidence this year was pretty strong that if we had gotten a normal kind of planting season, we could have had a trend yield of 160 or so on 80, right at 90 million acres harvested, almost a 15 billion bushel corn crop. Prices would have been back in the $4 range, and off to the races we go. That's probably not going to happen now, but still, it underscores the impact of a short crop year as opposed to a quantum change, and so I think we need to keep that in mind. March stocks, the lowest since 2004. So we're tight corn going into the summer, as I pointed out. Those June 1st stocks, when they come out, I think are going to be, again, lowest since 2004. Interestingly, that crop that was feeding into those stocks that year was about the same size as last year's crop. So it's not an accident that those stocks are the same. The problem is we have much higher usage now than we did at that time. Whoops, wrong button. Of course, planting progress has been well documented, the slowest on record. I've always kept track of what's the slowest, and it was the 1993 before, interestingly, a very wet year to this point. One that may be somewhat analogous if it keeps raining. If it doesn't keep raining, I guess we go to 47. But still, it started to look like that with cool temperatures. If we look at emergence, way slower than in 2008, which was the slowest we had on record. Crop condition report came out on Monday. That one about normal for this kind of year, but you notice there's a pretty narrow range to crop conditions early in the year, and then the spread starts happening as things start developing. Of course, last year, the worst we've ever had, and it doesn't tell us a lot other than we've kind of started in a normal way this year. Where will yields be? Again, Elwin pointed out there are a number of yields that you can use or trends that you can use. The one that I've used historically is the red one here that goes from 1960 to present. If you throw in last year's observation, it shifts that line to where the black line is there. The 158 that the USDA had in the last WASDE is right on that line. 147, of course, would be significantly below it. The blue line is what I call the biotech trend, and it would be the one that analogous to this kind of quiet weather period that Elwin talked about. And, of course, the 6 years of above-trend yields would be on that one, too. Some folks say, well, you need to use that newest one because that's when we've had biotech seeds. My problem is it had no bad weather years in it until last year, and so I've always been somewhat skeptical of it. I'm even more skeptical of it now, but I put it in there just so that you got a comparison. I did pull the data on, if we take the difference between planted and intended acres that happen in a given crop year versus percent planted on June 2nd. And that's the scatter diagram on the left. And you can see that in years when we've had about 85 or 86%, we were very close to having as many acres planted as we had intended at this point. So, I don't know if we'll have a lot of abandonment. The oddball in that was 93, when it stayed wet the rest of the month of June. We didn't catch up any. If you look on the right, that's harvested versus intended acres. And again, there, about 8 million lower, and this number is always 6 to 8 million lower because of abandonment and those kind of things that happen in some cases. But 93 was almost 14 million lower. So we don't have a lot of data points to give us an idea of what is the normal thing for an 86% planted on June 2nd. But you can also see that there's not a lot of statistical relationship between those numbers of getting the corn planted versus how many acres actually get planted or how many acres get harvested. A slight positive relationship in the chart at the right, but something I thought is important to kind of look at as far as history goes. The May WASDE, of course, now will be adjusted next week. We look for USDA to reduce that yield to 147 or so. That will take the crop down to about 13 billion bushels or a little less, 12.9 I think. Would take about 1.2 billion off of availability. I still think feed and residual is high. I said that a while ago, so a downward revision there would not be a surprise. I don't think they're going to change ethanol very much from where they were at that point. They could adjust exports down a bit, but even with that lower crop, we could still come up with a carryover somewhere in the mid 1.5, around 1.5 billion, and that would give us some break this year. the stocks-to-use ratio would be about 12. If we look at the relationship here, you can see based on a 15% stocks-to-use ratio, their price range looks a bit high to me. Now, I think with a 12 stocks-to-use ratio, price range in the 5 to 6 range would be pretty reasonable. On the soybean side, again, same story here, slow planting, slow emergence, among the slowest ever. That will probably, we don't know that will have as big an impact on the soybeans harvest as a yield as it will on corn. Elwin told you a while ago, one of the things, soybeans, if they get some rain in August, they will tend to bloom again and grow. The plant will actually grow again, where corn will not do that. We saw it happen last year, that August rains really saved the soybean crop, I think. And so we're still not pulling back off of that trend yield very much. I've seen some numbers, 42 or 43 bushels. I think that's judgment still well ahead of us on the soybean yield. The acres planted there, liable to have some acres that don't get planted on the soybean side as well. But still, a significant increase in carryover stocks is still very likely this year. And bean meal prices somewhere in the low 300s, maybe down near 300. Now, right now, the futures markets aren't even close to that for next year. They're in the 380 range, just straight across the board. So they're kind of factoring in some shorter bean crop than what I think we still possibly can get as we go forward this year. You can see the 2013 observation there against stocks-to-use ratios in the mid-$10 range if that kind of yield comes out and we get all those acres planted. So there's where we are on the meal prices based on the futures. When I ran this chart, I looked at that and I said, wait a minute, there's no way that a set of futures prices can come out with that straight a line. So I went back and checked about 4 times to make sure I was getting the right data, and sure enough, that's what it says at the moment. So, summary. We're again in a weather situation, especially with corn. The late plantings impact yield, acreage, and of course frost risk, and some of those we'll know pretty quickly, others we're going to have to wait on. A good yield, I still think you could have corn down in the 4s. I've had somebody who tell me a while ago, I don't think that's in the cards, but if it was to turn off 90-degree days, 3 inches of rain mid-July, 3 inches of rain mid-August, and have a frost back into October a little ways, I don't see any reason we couldn't have a 150-plus national yield. That would be very possible. What we're expecting right now and kind of what we were a year before last, I think we'll put corn in the $5 range somewhere. If we have continued weather problems, either continued wet like in 93, or the problem such as even a worse problem, in my opinion, would be in 1947 where it turns off dry, this $7 plus is still in the cards this year. So a lot of uncertainty, just like we were a year ago, and that's going to have to play out before we know. Soybeans, world supply is certainly helping. A big Brazilian crop this year, bigger than ours, is kind of keeping the world situation in check. Normal yield will still get us back down into that 10, 11, maybe a bit above 11 range. I think meal in the $300 range is pretty likely, and if we can get that, we'll be in over here on the left side on my cost model, which this year average costs are at 93. We'll be down around 80. And a $13 a hundredweight or $26 a head change in cost of production is a pretty positive thing, regardless of what the hog market's doing. And so that would put us in profitable situation for much of next year if we can kind of get those kind of cost levels. Any questions? John? The question was, is there a way we can capture some data on this PED virus that's out there and what's going on with that? I don't know of any way to capture numbers yet, and I've been trying to kind of, every time I talk to one of the vets that have been involved in those discussions, say, what kind of numbers are you talking about? And so far, I think they said 123 locations. About 2/3 of them are grow finish locations. So those probably don't have anything to do other than the timing of supply. They were not going to kill very many pigs on there. Sow farms, of course, from what I understand, this is much like TGE, kill most of the pigs less than 3 weeks old, or for sure less than 2 weeks old. So if it's that number of farms, and if it doesn't grow significantly, I don't think we'll ever see it in the hog numbers this fall for a couple of reasons. One is all of those are spread out over at least 6 or 8 weeks now, and they're going to come in October and November when we got plenty of other pigs anyway. So I doubt that we will see it. It was always hard to even find the TGE losses of the past. And it's kind of always been hard. Every winter somebody calls me and says, "Oh my God, PRRS has killed every pig in Minnesota." And I say, well, you might think it's killed every pig in Minnesota, but I'll bet you it hasn't. And even PRRS, I've had very difficult times finding it in the numbers. Because where it's bad this year, it wasn't bad last year. And where it was bad last year, it's not bad this year. And those people that don't have the big death losses, they never say anything. Okay? So I'm not putting anything in my numbers yet, John. Until if it gets a lot more widespread, then we'll have to start thinking about that. Yeah, Jimmy. Well, it's going to be very different. The question is how much higher do we see wheat feeding being above normal? It's going to be very different for the two areas of wheat. I mean, I think you're going to go back to 2011 wheat feeding areas in the southeast like we did 2 years ago. I mean, we've had a lot of wheat 2 years ago. And I think that's going to grow pretty dramatically this year, especially here at the end of this crop year. You know, if you can get that stuff harvested and use it here at the end of the crop year, there's going to be a lot of feed. There's not going to be any to speak of available in the Southwest. So I always lump the numbers together, and so it's kind of the tale of two things. We ought to look at those separately. But I'd say a significant increase, and I didn't look at the individual numbers, so I can't tell you a bushel number, on the soft red winter wheat, because it's usually priced a little, it's usually more price competitive anyway. But on hard red, boy, what I've seen of the crop damage out there, I don't think there's going to be a lot of wheat feeding out that way. What there is will probably be in the cattle yards. Okay, let's talk about demand and this livestock species. Demand, obviously key issues from the macro standpoint. Housing market in the United States has been improving. Low interest rates have certainly given that. Job growth, we've gained some jobs, not at a real robust level, but we have gained jobs in the last 12 months. The wealth effect has been positive for those who still had money in the equity markets with record high equity indexes. The only problem is there's a lot of people that don't have money in the equity markets after the recession. The unemployment rate is certainly falling very slowly. I don't think we'll see a number under 7 this year. We'll probably, I think we're going to have to revisit and reconsider what the natural rate of unemployment is. From a policy standpoint, it looks like the Fed has said we're not going to do anything different until we get something under 7. Then they're going to have to say, okay, what's kind of the natural rate of unemployment, which there is a natural rate of unemployment, and we'd pushed the unemployment rate down into the 5s, and I would argue that was unsustainable at the time, and it certainly has proven that way. And so I think we're probably going to kind of set our sights somewhere in the mid-6s on this at longer term, and we economists will battle that out and talk about what that number is. But it's going to be a policy issue at some point of at what point do you do stimulative action on the economy, at what point do you start cooling off the economy, and unemployment rate has always been one of the measures of that. Maybe good or maybe bad, but it's easy to talk about, and so it's probably going to be there. Long-term deficit and spending probably has to be reined in. I always make the point that I'm a member of no organized political party. I am a Republican. So the Fed is still easing. And by the way, Will Rogers did say that about your Democrats in the 1920s, John. So Fed is still easing. Now, the monetary easing, as it does that, I guess the question I throw out there is it monetary easing if everyone is doing it? I don't know. It doesn't seem to me to be. And, of course, the Japanese have jumped on that one pretty hard. And this isn't any better than yesterday. I should have thought about fixing that. This is a world map that's supposed to show you where the bad spots are. And let's suffice it to say that the bad spots are Europe and Japan. And Japan is the addition to that over the last 12 months. and they've certainly taken some bold action from a monetary standpoint, and it has caused the pink line on the right is the Japanese yen has lost about 20% of its value since September. And long term, that's of some concern to us from a buying power of our #1 value export market. The rest of the exchange rates, I think, are pretty steady and don't really say that we're having any gains or losses, especially relative to our competitors on the left. But the Japanese one, from an exchange rate standpoint, and that's strictly a function of the government there easing monetary policy to try to get them out of this deflationary period. GDP in the U.S. grew by about 2.5% in the first quarter, a significant increase from the fourth quarter last year when government spending and net exports really hurt GDP. The good thing about that near zero number in the fourth quarter was that personal consumption and business fixed investment both grew pretty dramatically. And if you have two components of GDP that you want to grow, it's consumption and investment. Those are the really important ones, I think, in the long run. So that near zero wasn't as bad as most near zeros. That sounds like real economists double speak, but I think it's true. But 2.4% in the first quarter, not bad, certainly not robust growth. I'm still concerned about personal disposable income per capita. Dead in the water. After a real big run-up in December, which was really caused by companies paying bonuses before the new tax, the Social Security tax went back up on January 1st. So again, a policy-induced move. It caused that to run up in December, which is good, but it dropped back down to near zero so far the rest of this year. And if you take out the growth of 2010 and 11, and remember this is year-over-year growth. So the reason there was positive year-over-year growth in 2010 and 11 was 2009 and 10 were so awful. Okay, they're comparing to really bad numbers, so they look somewhat good. This number's just not been very good, and this is the money that folks spend on cars and meat and whatever it is, eating out, whatever they do, and I don't think we're going to get real robust demand growth until we get some increase in the amount of money that our consumers have to spend. They have not reduced their consumption of beef, pork, and chicken and turkey quite as much as we thought. I thought it was going to go below 200 pounds last year. Probably won't do that again until next year. But let's remember that consumption is not demand. Demand is the alternative levels of product that a consumer is able and willing to buy at different prices. And so price figures into that. And so if we look at lower consumption, we have to say, well, do people not want meat? And the answer to that, I think, is clearly no. They do want meat because they're willing to pay very high prices for it. Record high prices for beef. We've been close to record prices for a year and a half now. Chicken set a record in December. Chicken price is liable to go up and set another record here given what their wholesale prices have done in the last couple months. But I think beef is going to set more records next year, maybe into 2015. And so when you look at the combination of consumption and price, our demand indexes are up fractionally for the 12 months ended in March, except for turkey. If we look at real per capita expenditures for the 3 or 4 species, we can see monthly that it's been a bit of a mixed bag for pork and beef on the left, but up so far for the year. On the right, chicken per capita expenditures have grown every month this year relative to a year ago. Turkey, of course, has struggled a bit here in the early going of this year. But still, all in all, while they're eating less, the reason they're eating less is we're bringing them less to eat. And we can't afford to bring them more product at the same price as we used to because costs are higher. And in the long run, consumers have to pay all costs. And that's kind of what we've had to do. Expenditures, record high. Price times quantity, record high last year. Going to set another record this year and very likely to set another record in 2014. Exports, that messed up too. Monthly exports to our major customers. The important ones on here, Japan still #1, Mexico still #2. China's covered up a little bit there, but the recent exports to China still on a long-term uptrend. Significantly lower than a year ago when we had that surge of exports to China. And the one that you can't see on here is the line for Russia, which goes up and goes to zero, and goes up and goes to zero, and goes up and goes to near zero, and goes up and goes to zero again. and that's life with the Ruskies. That's just the way it is. The Brazilians told us that a long time ago. My friend Paul Aho, who's a very good poultry analyst, said that the poultry industry, the chicken industry in the United States, has decided that some customers are so bad that they're not worth having, and that's Russia. And I think we're probably going to conclude the same thing and kind of pencil them in at a very small number, and if it actually goes up from that, we'll count that as gravy. But I'm not hearing of much news of any reconciliation of these challenges we have with Russia for this year, and part of that is because the whole situation with Russia isn't probably about ractopamine, it's more about protecting their domestic industry. So exports, record large last year, probably going to be lower this year, a little lower in fact than the 2011 level. It's very, very difficult for us to make records every year like we once did. The numbers are just too large to push that number up. Ractopamine, again, I don't think it's really about ractopamine. It's mainly about protection in both China and Russia. Exports there, last year, Russia accounted for 1.2% of our production, China for 3.4%, so 4.5% between them. If all of that product has to come back into this market, I would expect a 10 to 15% price impact. If we look at prices relative to where I thought they were going to be this spring and summer, we're down about 7 or 8%, and the fact is that we haven't had to bring all of that Chinese product back into the market. And so a pretty strong argument to say, in my opinion, that our problem has been exports. Demand summary, indexes slightly higher this year. With chicken leading, I think that's going to continue. I think those could actually get a little stronger, especially if we can get per capita disposable income going up. Still concerned about those income levels. New pork export records, I think, are in big doubt. I don't think they're going to happen this year. The weaker yen is a concern. MCOOL retaliation by the Canadians, if it happens, will not become a factor until next year. So we don't have to worry about that, I don't think, in 2013. Higher beef and chicken prices could be very positive for pork demand. Questions about the demand side? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The question was the situation with Smithfield, how much will that deal with demand and how much have I put it into what I've talked here? No, I did these slides before that was announced, so no, it's not in here. I think it's too early for us to really decide how much that's going to be. And the other thing we have to do is we're going to have to compare what exports to China with the Smithfield merger would be compared to what we think they might have been otherwise. And my point has been, I think exports were going to grow to China anyway, and the question is how much faster will they grow? And I believe they will because of this acquisition. So they could help demand next year by doing that. It'll be into 2014 before we see much of that impact. So I don't think it's going to come into play to any great degree in 2013 regardless. All right, let's run through these pretty quick. A year ago, last October, over 50% of the pasture country in the United States was in poor or very poor condition. That was far worse than even in 2011 when we had that drought. When we had the drought in Oklahoma and Texas. As we start this year, very high percentage for April of pastures in poor or very poor condition. That could go either way. I mean, I grew up in Oklahoma, and I can tell you just because it rained in May doesn't mean it's going to rain in July and August there. And so this could go either way. But the point is this could have some impact on what's going on in the cow herd. We look at hay availability, very tight supplies in December relative to a year ago in the northern plains. This number shows that there was more hay in Texas and Oklahoma in December 1, 2012 than there was in 11. And all that means was there wasn't hardly any hay there in 2011, I can tell you that. So that's one of those year-over-year plays of numbers. So there just isn't much carrying capacity for this cow herd. Huge numbers of beef cows slaughtered in the summer of 2011. I mentioned a while ago that's really just now having its impact. Last year we didn't kill quite as many, and we're not killing very many cows now as the industry's trying to get in position to grow. They know there's going to be some opportunities there. The question is, are they going to have the resources to get it done? The same thing for feedlot placements. The summer of 11, big numbers of cattle came in because there just wasn't any grass for them. Last year, much lower numbers because there just weren't that many calves out there. We had already placed a bunch of them. We had a lower calf crop. We're going to have the same thing happen this year. If we see long-term trends on the cow herd, it's down. Long-term trends on the calf crop, it's down, but both of those have accelerated in the last couple of years here. And so very tight feeder cattle supplies on January 1, fractionally larger this year. But out of that supply, we've placed more cattle 3 out of 4 months so far this year. So what does that tell you about how many feeder cattle we have left to place this year? That's going to get tight. And these number of cattle on feed is still below a year ago. It's going to remain below a year ago. These cattle numbers are really going to stay tight, I think, through 2013 into 2014, and a lot depends on what happens on the grass. Now, the beef business kept production higher last year by making all those cattle bigger. And not just a little bigger, a lot bigger, 20 pounds a head. And they did it mainly through the use of Zilmax and Optiflex. It changed the marginal cost, marginal revenue decision of that last 20 or 30 days on feed, and they added a lot of weight. But look what weights are doing now compared to a year ago. They're just about the same. We're not going to grow weights another 20 or 30 pounds this year, even if feed gets a little bit cheaper, I think. So I think we're going to be locked in close to the same weights that we were last year on lower cattle numbers, and so beef production is actually going to go down this year more than it did last year. And our forecast for beef per capita beef consumption, and you can scratch through consumption and say availability there, because we eat what we produce, is down 3% this year and down another 5% in 2014 on a per capita basis. And if we do that, we're going to see those very, very high retail prices. That's going to be positive for pork demand. Now, the business is poised to grow. They're kept 2% more heifers were held back for beef cow replacements on January 1 this year than was last year. And last year, that number was about 2% than the year larger than the year before that. Problem is, the heifers that were held last year never got placed in the cow herd. All right? There wasn't enough grass. They've ended up going to yards. I would argue that the heavyweight placements that we saw in April, most of the increase in placements in April was heavyweight cattle. A good chunk of those were heifers that got moved out of the cow herd and into the feedlot. Now, those heifers could come back into cow herds if the rain comes in time here. That's possible. So we're going to have to watch other disappearance out of feed yards here this summer, but I think some of these heifers are already gone, and so we may not get much growth in the cow herd this year. This is an example of if Steve will just say the same thing long enough, it will finally come true. And beef did finally go above $200 a hundredweight about 4 weeks ago. Record high, $210. I think we're going to stay in this $200, $210 range probably for 6 or 8 weeks here this summer. Seasonally lower into the 180 or 90 range, though, not much lower than that, about where we were last year, maybe a little higher into the fall of this year, and then probably challenge those records again next summer. So very high beef prices, going to leave some space in the retail counter, I think, for pork demand. It's going to be a positive for us, as the price of competitors is a positive influencer of the demand for your product. So there's the summary on cattle. We've gone through it. I mentioned all those. I think the point to make on this whole thing is the last point. You know, we've talked a lot about, are we out pricing pork out of the market? Well, relative to beef, we're not even close. And I think, you know, beef could cease to be a habit for people above the middle class. I mean, you know, or below the middle class. It's tough. I tell the story this past spring. I was making a pot of chili for a church men's group chili cook-off. And by the way, it was pretty good. It should have won. But I was serving it to Yankees, John. I mean, you know, I don't know. So it was a problem. But I had this pot, and I got to adding it up, and I had $23 worth of ground beef in this thing. And it wasn't a very big pot, all right? And I wasn't buying high-dollar stuff. This was you shouldn't be high-dollar stuff. But I had $23 worth of ground beef, and the thought occurred to me, you know, there are a lot of families can't afford to put $23 worth of ground beef in one pot. I mean, they really can't. And so I think this is a legitimate question for the industry long term. Chicken, our favorite subject. Broiler hatchery flock began to grow in November. That's a little early from a seasonal standpoint. Every month so far this year, it's been about 2% larger than last year. So to me, this is a business that's poising itself to grow if they get the cost level and the margins that would say to do it. With 2% more hens, they can probably set 3 to 5% more eggs if they want to, and place that many more chicks and really jack up their production. They haven't done that yet. Broiler egg sets have run above year ago most of this year, and they're up about 1.3% year to date. Broiler production, though, is up almost 3% this year because weights keep getting bigger. And in this case, it's not that all the chickens are getting heavier, it's that more of the chicken business is going to the big boning birds and less of it to the small parts birds. And there was a major change in that whole deal, I think, this spring when Kentucky Fried Chicken announced they were going to use boneless product in their original recipe. They've never put the original recipe on boneless product before. And so I think that's recognition, A, that the business is going toward those big boning birds, and that's where the supply is going to be, and B, will probably provide some fuel for that change. And by the way, if you haven't had it, it's a pretty good product. It's a pretty good product. And they were offering dark meat as well. And lo and behold, what has happened to boneless, skinless chicken breasts since they announced that? They've gone out the roof. Now, this is a spot market price, and there are a lot of long-term contracts in this. So the cost of boneless, skinless chicken breasts to all the retail stores hasn't gone up that fast, but it is indicative that something has changed as far as who is buying this product. And there's some, I guess, some longer-term promotions that are being stocked up for and some of that, but I think KFC is one of them. They pushed the broiler cutout up above 110. We compute that number. Leg quarters have gone up. They are using dark meat product, but I think that's probably the Russians buying to backfill pork and beef that they're no longer bringing in from the United States. Of course, wings have struggled. It's been the darling of the business for a long time, and they're down somewhat. I think they're going to go back to a more normal seasonal pattern where they go down in the summer and come back in the winter around the holidays. Okay, hogs and pork. Here's what I alluded to earlier about the change in the growth pattern. I would argue that if it wasn't for higher costs, we would be up here instead of back near this long-term growth, but still steady growth in pork production relative to the breeding herd. It's a real tale of efficiency and improving efficiency that goes back a long ways, of course, but still, you're still gaining even now. Pigs per litter have gone up 2% per year for 5 years. It looks like that has slowed. I'm penciling in about 1.5% for this year, probably next year as well. But if we get into an expansion mode, that number will actually go up faster because the gilts you'll be laying back will be better than the sows that you're selling in most cases. And so I think the productivity could increase a little bit from that, but I'm penciling 1.5 now. On litters per breeding animal, you can see the litter number of litters is going up at about the same pace as the breeding herd, so we're not changing that number nearly like we were in the prior 20 years. On weights, we flattened them out every time that feed prices have gone up. We did it again last year, and it was a pretty radical move last fall when people were trying to take pigs to market so much earlier, and we put these weights right back to year-ago levels or the 5-year average. We're still 2 pounds below. I think we're going to stay about 2 pounds below until somewhere here in late June or July when you'll see those lines cross. Then depending what feed costs do, we could run market weights up 2 to 3 pounds all the way through the fourth quarter. And I think we're probably going to get feed cheap enough to do that, even though it won't be very cheap at all. We'll probably add that weight back onto these pigs this fall. So the weight impact on annual production is going to be negative in the first half of the year, positive at about the same amount in the second half, about even on production as we go through this year. Imports of Canadian pigs have tailed off a bit here in the early part of this year. And I think this is really the function just of the economic hardships and the reductions in the Canadian breeding herd. Now, one of our problems going forward is we're only going to have 2 reads a year on the Canadian breeding herd. They've eliminated 2 of their hogs and pigs reports, and so we're not getting very good data out of there now. I don't think this is any kind of MCOOL impact at this point. If these rules that became final last week go into effect in 6 months, I think the MCOOL situation could reduce the number of pigs we bring from Canada because it increases the segregation challenges of handling those pigs at the farm, getting them through a plant. You can't put any mixed labels on. They all have to be completely segregated anymore under these new rules. And so that could put a negative impact on bringing in Canadian feeder pigs, but not significantly here in the short term. Costs for this year, as of last Friday, about $94. I mentioned that before, significantly higher than last year. Even last year was about $90. If we go look at the 2014 numbers here, they're all in the mid-80s. that number, those numbers were down close to 80 just a few weeks ago before this futures market came back up a bit. If we lay hogs on top of there, we've got profits for next year. If we got $98 hogs here on cash this summer, we've got some profits right now. I think we will have some losses in the fourth quarter. But this year as a year is not going to be very good, somewhere in the minus $13 a head range, a little worse than a year ago. I think it's remarkable that through those kind of losses, this business has been able to maintain. I mean, producers had a better equity situation and did a better job of managing risk. These numbers are based on cash buying of grain and cash selling of hogs. No risk management, no futures positions in there. Okay? So if you did any better on cost of gain or cost of feed and any better on hog prices than what the cash market was, you'd be better off in this. And I think that was a significant factor in the industry over the last couple of years. Sow slaughter is lower than the 5-year average. If we take this as a percentage of the breeding herd, it's a little closer to the 5-year average, but still low. It tells me, and that's in the face of almost record high sow prices. I think we're building the sow herd a bit, kind of going along. We were 0.3 up back in December. We were 0.6 up in March. I think the June hogs and pigs report is probably going to have us a short 1%, somewhere around 1% up on the breeding herd. We're getting poised to grow too if we get good corn prices or good lower corn prices, just like the chicken folks, even though we're not nearly as flexible as they are. The March hogs and pigs report was a bit of a surprise on that sow herd, a little bit bigger than what we'd thought. The breeding herd on the market herd up somewhat across the board here and larger than what was thought. There's the increase in pigs per litter was 1.1%, giving the year's average at about 1.3. Hog slaughter weekly, I expect the numbers to be larger this summer than last, mainly because, and all depending on weather, because weather was a major determinant of those slaughter levels last year. I think fourth quarter slaughter is going to be just a bit smaller. If we look quarterly here, 1.5% up in the third quarter, that influenced by one more slaughter day as well, so that would be just fractionally higher in the third quarter. Without that, up about 1% in the second quarter, down 1.8 in the fourth, for an annual total of slaughter very close to last year. If the weight thing works out like I'm thinking, lower the first half, higher the second, we'll be very close on a production standpoint. Of course, the cutout value back up in the mid-90s. This is a pretty nice seasonal rally. The only problem is it started so darn low. We thought we would start this seasonal rally in the mid-80s and run it up at just above $100, or maybe 104 or 5 on the cutout value. But because of those export problems in March, we were kind of dead in the water for about 6 weeks. On hog prices, of course, this is producer sold negotiated net prices. This was last week's price. We're going to be up here close to $100 on net prices by the time we get to the end of the week, I think, for this week. So very nice run up there. I didn't think we'd get to $100 this summer. Maybe we won't yet. But we're going to trade this thing sideways here in the mid-90s, maybe lower 90s. The cash market's a little higher than what I had forecasted it to be at this point for the rest of the year. Here are my quarterly forecasts for this year, as well as those at the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Iowa State University in Missouri. And we're all kind of in agreement. Of course, we kind of all come out of the same training, so you'd expect that. If you look at where the futures are, they're right in, pretty much in the middle of my ranges, maybe a little toward the top as of last week. Those would be a little bit better than that now. I don't think they're enough better to say this is clearly a hedging opportunity. But depending on what you can face on risk, if you want to pull the trigger on futures prices at this point, I don't think you're going to leave much money on the table, and you will remove the risk of an adverse event between now and then. Next spring, somewhere in the $83, $84 range, going up into the 90s again probably next summer. I don't have any numbers for that and won't until we have the June hogs and pigs report here in about 3 weeks. The big changeover, of course, this spring was mandatory price reporting for pork, and I don't think I've seen many things in my career that have surprised me as much as the relationship between the mandatory cutout value and the voluntary cutout value. I would have bet the farm that the mandatory numbers would have been lower than the voluntary. And the reason was, with so much formulated product, there was a very strong incentive to report the top of the market on the voluntary. And so my thinking was that if we make them report all of them, they're going to report the lower ones, and the weighted average will be lower than what we saw before, and so the value will be lower. And it hasn't worked that way at all. And there's several reasons. One of them is that in this cutout value and in some of the calculations that are used at USDA on the prices, they're using a different set of yields than was in the voluntary. Those yields that were used in the voluntary, the yield of picnics or bellies or whatever it is of the carcass, were about 7 years old, 6 or 7. And the hogs you've been bringing are better than what those yields represented. Part of the negotiations on the rulemaking on this whole system was talking to the packers about reporting yields. Now, the packers quite correctly said, wait a minute, what does reporting yields have to do with reporting prices? You have to say, well, no, not much. Okay. But to their credit, they said, yeah, but we can't have these things getting that old again. And so they agreed that they're going to report yields once a year to USDA, and I think that's plenty. I don't think the hogs change that much in a year, but over 6 years they change a lot. And so that's to their credit that they're once a year going to report updated yield, cut yields for all of their plants, and USDA will compute averages based on that. So we shouldn't have this kind of jump again. The second factor here is that there are so many value-added products being reported now. The old report had about 20 products on most days. Some days now can have 80. And a lot of them are boneless, closely trimmed, new specs. They're high-value products. And so that brings the average up some. Third factor, it includes export sales to Canada and Mexico. Now, I didn't think that would be a very big deal because those cuts are kind of the same as the ones we use here. We don't include exports to Asia or other export markets because those cuts are very different. Single rib bellies, and you'd have to adjust that back to a belly. Collar butt, closely trimmed collar butts or spec trimmed collar butts or something like that. So we don't include those, but apparently, from what I'm hearing in the trade, the NAFTA export products are a bit premium priced, and so they're in there. And finally, this includes less than truckload shipments as well as truckload shipments, where the old voluntary system was only truckloads, and just logically, LTL shipments are going to be a little higher price per unit. So all of that adds up that this cutout value ran $3 to $6 higher than the old one when we had it. It also, because the new prices were higher, it really dried up the voluntary price reporting very quickly. And by April, we weren't getting enough reported under the voluntary system to run them parallel like we had hoped to do for some time period. And we'd hoped to run them parallel so we could know the differences and adjust all of our formulas and that. It was a good effort. It was a well-intended effort. It was a good idea, but it didn't work out. And so now you're back to just dickering over the deal and figuring out how you're going to do the new formulas. If you're using the cutout value, how do you use that? I've argued and I've told packers every time I've got in front of them that that difference needs to be shared. Part of it's due to what you do on the farm. Part of it's due to what they do. Somewhere in between there is where they need to be, not just knocking $6 off of the new cutout value and saying that's what we're going to pay. Okay? So it's a process. Anytime you change an information series, you have pains like this. As an analyst, I don't know exactly what to do with new data when all my history is the old voluntary system. But I'm just going to have to figure that out and do the best I can with it for a year or two, and then we'll be comparing apples and apples again, and off we go. But for a while, there's always changeovers. So, summary. Beef industry still impacted by the 11 drought. The 12 drought impact is still to come. It's going to influence their output for a couple of years here yet. It's going to be pretty short. I think we're going to have very strong beef prices, and that's going to be positive for pork demand. Chicken slowed a lot in 2011, but is poised to grow and can do so quickly. The biology of this critter really helps them fill in gaps of protein supply, and they'll do it at the drop of a hat if they can. The question is, what's feed going to cost them? And in their case, soybean meal is relatively more important than is corn. So what does that say about the big South American soybean crop? That puts them in a position to be a little more confident at this point than we are. Pork industry, of course, we took the huge equity hit. I'm amazed that we've stood it as well as we have, but we're still poised to keep growing and grow into 2014 and 15 if we get costs back at a more reasonable level. And finally, the Corn Belt rains have certainly been good. We need some dry, warm days now, and I still think we can raise a pretty darn good crop.